The snow fell in sheets so thick that Henry Fallon could barely see 3 feet ahead of his horse, and it was only by pure chance that he spotted the dark shape half buried in the white drifts beside the narrow mountain trail. December 1883 had brought one of the worst blizzards to hit the Washington Territory in decades, and Henry had been trying to reach Republic before nightfall when he saw what he first thought was a fallen log. His gelding snorted and stamped nervously, and that was when Henry noticed the blue fabric peeking through the snow, the unmistakable shape of a human hand reaching out as if grasping for help that had never come. He was off his horse in seconds, his boots sinking deep into the powder as he stumbled toward the figure. His gloved hands brushed away the snow frantically, revealing a young woman dressed in clothes far too thin for this weather, her lips tinged blue, her face pale as death itself. Henry pressed his fingers to her throat, searching desperately for a pulse, and nearly shouted with relief when he felt the faint flutter beneath her frozen skin. She was alive, but barely, and if he did not get her warm soon, she would not stay that way for long. Without hesitation, Henry lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp and cold against his chest. He secured her on his horse as best he could, then climbed up behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around them both. The cabin he had passed about a mile back would have to do. It was an old trapper's shelter he had used before, rough and barely furnished, but it had 4 walls and a fireplace, and that was all that mattered right now. The ride seemed to take forever, the wind howling around them like a living thing, trying to tear them from the saddle. Henry held the woman tight against him, sharing what little warmth his body could provide, talking to her even though she could not hear him, telling her to hold on, to keep fighting. By the time he spotted the cabin through the white curtain of snow, his arms were aching, and his face was numb from the cold. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her gently on the single cot in the corner. The cabin was freezing, dark, and smelled of must and old pine, but it was shelter. Henry moved with practiced efficiency, his hands shaking as much from urgency as from cold. He got the fire started first, coaxing the kindling to life with the precious matches he kept dry in his saddlebag. Once the flames began to catch and grow, he turned his attention back to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through, frozen in places, and he knew he had to get them off her before hypothermia claimed her completely. His hands hesitated for just a moment, but necessity won out over propriety. He worked as quickly and respectfully as he could, removing her wet dress, her thin stockings, her sodden boots. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find in the cabin, then added his own bedroll for good measure. Her skin was like ice to the touch, her breathing so shallow he had to lean close to be sure she was still drawing air. Henry spent the next several hours in a state of controlled panic, stoking the fire until the cabin became almost unbearably warm, checking her pulse every few minutes, watching for any sign of improvement. He heated water and used cloths to warm her hands and feet, being careful not to rub too hard, remembering what an old doctor had once told him about frostbite. He talked to her, his voice low and steady, telling her stories about anything he could think of, about his ranch, about his horse, about the time he once saw a bear try to steal honey from a tree and ended up covered in angry bees. As night fell and the storm continued to rage outside, Henry finally allowed himself to sit down, exhausted. He pulled a chair close to the cot and watched her face in the firelight. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair that spread across the pillow like spun gold. Even pale and half frozen, she was beautiful, with delicate features and long lashes that cast shadows on her cheeks. He found himself wondering who she was, what she had been doing out in that storm, why she had been alone and so poorly dressed for the weather. Hours passed. Henry dozed in his chair, jerking awake every few minutes to check on her, to add more wood to the fire. It was near dawn, the storm finally beginning to quiet, when he heard a soft sound from the cot. He was on his feet instantly, leaning over her. Her eyelids were fluttering, her head moving slightly from side to side. "Easy now," Henry said softly, his hand finding hers beneath the blankets. "You are safe. Take your time." Her eyes opened slowly, confused and unfocused at first. They were blue, he noticed, the color of the sky just before a storm. She stared up at him for a long moment, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of where she was and who he was. Then panic flooded her face and she tried to sit up, gasping. "Whoa, whoa," Henry said, gently pressing her shoulder. "You need to stay still. You have been unconscious for hours. I found you in the snow." "Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and scared. "Where am I?" "My name is Henry Fallon." "You are in a trapper's cabin about 10 miles outside Republic, Washington. I found you on the mountain trail yesterday evening. You were half buried in the snow. Do you remember what happened?" She closed her eyes, her face twisting with the effort of remembering. "The stage," she whispered. "There was an accident. The stage overturned. The driver. He was thrown, his neck." She opened her eyes again, tears gathering. "Everyone else was dead. I tried to walk to find help, but the snow—" "You were incredibly lucky," Henry said quietly. "Another hour out there and you would not have made it." A tear slid down her cheek. "Maybe that would have been better." Something in her voice, in the hollow way she said it, made Henry's chest tighten. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, still holding her hand. "I do not know what you have been through," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "but I do know that you survived for a reason. You fought to stay alive out there. That means something." She turned her face away from him, more tears falling silently. "You do not understand." "Then help me understand." He squeezed her hand gently. "What is your name?" For a moment he thought she would not answer. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Beatrice, Beatrice Miller." "Beatrice." He said her name like it was something precious. "You are safe now. And whatever you are running from, whatever made you think dying in the snow would be better than living, you do not have to face it alone anymore. I give you my word on that." She turned back to look at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he meant it. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she gave the smallest of nods, her fingers curling around his. They stayed like that as the morning light began to filter through the cabin's single window. The storm finally spent, leaving the world outside pristine and white and silent. Henry made weak broth from his supplies, helping Beatrice sit up enough to sip it slowly. She was still weak, still cold despite the fire and the blankets, but there was color returning to her cheeks now, life returning to her eyes. As she drank, he told her more about himself, keeping his voice easy and conversational, trying to help her relax. He told her about his ranch on the outskirts of Republic, how he had built it with his own hands over the past 5 years, how he raised horses and cattle and lived alone except for his dog, Bear, who was probably worried sick about him by now. He told her about the town, about the people there, about how Republic was small but growing, full of decent folks trying to make honest livings. Beatrice listened, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finally paused, she said, "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know anything about me." "I know you needed help and I was there to give it," Henry said simply. "That is enough. Most men would have kept riding." "Then most men are fools." He set the empty bowl aside. "Beatrice, I meant what I said. You are not alone anymore. Once you are strong enough, I will take you to Republic. We can get you proper clothes, a room at the boarding house, help you figure out what to do next. Or if you need to go somewhere else, I will help you get there. No questions asked, no debts owed. All right. She nodded slowly, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust kindness. He did not press. He simply stood and said, "You should rest more. I am going to check on my horse and see about getting us something more substantial to eat. I will be right outside if you need anything." The storm had left nearly 3 feet of snow on the ground, and the world sparkled under the weak morning sun like it had been covered in diamonds. Henry's gelding, a sturdy bay named Copper, was huddled against the side of the cabin where Henry had tied him with access to the small lean-to. The horse was cold but fine, and Henry made sure he had feed and water before trudging around to see what he could salvage from his supplies. He was checking his saddlebags when he heard the cabin door creak open behind him. He turned to see Beatrice standing in the doorway, wrapped in one of the blankets, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked impossibly fragile against the vast white landscape. "You should be inside," Henry said, walking quickly back to her. "You are still too weak to be up." "I needed to see it," Beatrice said softly, her eyes on the mountains rising in the distance. "I needed to see that I really survived." Henry stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed the blanket. "You survived, and you are going to keep surviving, Beatrice. I promise you that." She turned to look up at him, and for the first time since she had woken, he saw something other than fear and pain in her eyes. It was tentative, fragile as new ice, but it was there. Hope. They stayed in the cabin for 2 more days, waiting for the worst of the snow to melt enough to make travel possible and for Beatrice to regain her strength. During that time, they talked. At first, Beatrice was guarded, giving only the barest details about herself. She had been traveling from Portland, she said, trying to reach a cousin in Spokane. The stage accident had happened in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. She did not elaborate on why she had been traveling, and Henry did not push. But slowly, as the hours passed, as Henry proved over and over that he was not going to hurt her or demand anything from her, she began to open up. On the second night, as they sat by the fire after a meal of rabbit Henry had snared, she finally told him the truth. "I was married," she said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee. "His name was Thomas. We married 2 years ago. I thought I was lucky. He was handsome, charming, successful. Everyone in Portland thought I had made such a good match." Henry stayed silent, watching her face in the firelight, seeing the way her jaw tightened. "He was a monster," Beatrice continued, her voice flat now, emotionless. "Not at first. At first he was everything a husband should be. But after the wedding, after we were alone, he changed, or maybe he just stopped pretending. He would get angry over nothing, over everything, and when he got angry—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He used his fists. And when fists were not enough, he used a belt or a cane or whatever else was nearby." Henry felt rage rising in his chest, hot and fierce, but he kept his expression calm, knowing she needed to get this out. "I tried to leave twice," Beatrice said. "Both times he found me and brought me back. The second time he broke my ribs and locked me in the cellar for 3 days. He told me if I ever tried again, he would kill me, and I believed him." She finally looked at Henry, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But then last month I found out I was pregnant. And I knew I could not let my child grow up in that house, with that man as a father. So I waited until Thomas went on a business trip to Seattle. I took what little money I had hidden away and I ran. I bought a ticket on the first stage heading east, hoping to reach my cousin in Spokane. Hoping Thomas would not be able to find me. He will not find you," Henry said, and there was steel in his voice. "I will make sure of that. You cannot promise that. He has money connections. If he wants to find me, he will. Then let him try." Henry leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Beatrice, I mean this. You are under my protection now. If your husband comes looking for you, he will have to go through me first, and I do not go down easy." Beatrice stared at him, and then, for the first time since he had found her, she smiled. It was small and sad, but it was real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" Henry was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Younger than me by 4 years. Her name was Margaret. When she was 20, she married a man my parents approved of. I did not like him, but I was young and stupid, and I figured it was not my business. 2 years later, she died. Fell down the stairs, they said. Tragic accident." His voice went hard. "But I saw the bruises at the funeral. I saw the way her husband did not even pretend to be sad. And I knew. I knew what had happened, and I had done nothing to stop it. I have had to live with that for 8 years. So when I say I will protect you, Beatrice, I mean it. I am not going to fail someone again." Beatrice set down her coffee and reached out, her hand covering his. "I am sorry about your sister," she said softly. "But what happened to her was not your fault. Maybe, maybe not. But what happens to you from here on out that I can control, and I choose to make sure you are safe." They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling between them, the night quiet outside. And something shifted in that moment, something neither of them had words for yet, but both of them felt. A connection forged in crisis, in honesty, in the simple act of one person reaching out to save another. On the 3rd day, the weather cleared enough for travel. Henry helped Beatrice onto Copper, then climbed up behind her, keeping one arm securely around her waist. She was still weak, and the ride would be difficult, but Republic was not far now. They could make it before dark if they did not push too hard. The journey down the mountain was slow and careful. The snow had drifted in places, making the trail treacherous, and Henry had to lead Copper by foot more than once to navigate the worst sections. But Beatrice did not complain, even though he could feel her shivering against him, her body tense with pain and exhaustion. When Republic finally came into view in the valley below, Henry felt Beatrice relax slightly against him. The town was small, just a few streets of buildings clustered around a central square, but it looked welcoming with smoke rising from chimneys and lights beginning to glow in windows as evening approached. "It is not much," Henry said, "but the people are good. You will be safe here." "It looks perfect," Beatrice said softly. Henry rode straight to the doctor's house, a neat white building on the edge of town. Dr. Samuel Wright was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he took one look at Beatrice and immediately ushered them inside. While the doctor examined her in his treatment room, Henry waited in the small parlor, pacing nervously, his hat clutched in his hands. When Dr. Wright finally emerged, Henry was on his feet instantly. "How is she?" "Remarkably well, considering what she went through," the doctor said. "She has some minor frostbite on her toes and fingers, but nothing that will not heal. She is severely malnourished and exhausted, and she has some old injuries that concern me. Healed fractures, scars. How long did you say she was in that stage accident?" Henry met the doctor's eyes steadily. "She had some trouble before the accident. A bad situation she escaped from. She is going to need somewhere safe to stay while she recovers. I was thinking the boarding house." Dr. Wright studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Mrs. Patterson runs a good establishment." "But Henry, if this woman is in some kind of danger—" "She is under my protection," Henry said firmly. "Anyone who comes looking to hurt her will answer to me." The doctor nodded again, satisfied. "She can go when she is ready. I told her she needs to rest for at least a week, eat proper meals, and come back if she has any problems. The baby seems fine, but she needs to take care of herself." Henry felt like he had been punched in the chest. "Baby, she is about 8 weeks along, I would say. She did not tell you." "She mentioned it," Henry said, working to keep his voice steady, "but I did not realize. I mean, I am glad the child is all right." When Beatrice emerged a few minutes later, still pale but cleaned up and wrapped in a shawl the doctor's wife had provided, her eyes found Henry's immediately. He could see the question there, the fear that knowing about her pregnancy might change how he felt about helping her. Henry simply offered his arm. "Come on, let us get you settled at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson." A motherly woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind heart took one look at Beatrice and seemed to understand without words that here was a young woman in need of sanctuary. She gave Beatrice the best room in the house, on the second floor with a view of the mountains, and told her not to worry about payment for now. "Henry Fallon vouching for you is good enough for me," she said briskly, tucking an extra quilt onto the bed. "You rest up, dear. I will bring you a tray for supper." After Mrs. Patterson bustled out, Henry stood awkwardly by the door, suddenly unsure what to say. Everything had happened so fast, and now that they were here, now that Beatrice was safe and warm and being looked after, he was not sure what came next. Beatrice solved the problem by crossing the room to him and taking his hands in hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for not judging me." "There is nothing to judge," Henry said gruffly. "You did what you had to do to survive. That takes more courage than most people have. I do not feel very courageous. Courage is not about not being scared. It is about being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. You have that in spades, Beatrice Miller." He squeezed her hands gently. "You get some rest now. I will come check on you tomorrow, if that is all right." "I would like that very much." Henry left the boarding house and walked through the darkening streets to his ranch on the outskirts of town. Bear, his enormous black and tan shepherd, greeted him with ecstatic joy, nearly knocking him over. Henry scratched the dog's ears and looked around at his home, the cabin he had built, the barn and corrals, the land he had worked so hard to cultivate. It all seemed different somehow, emptier than it had before. He could not stop thinking about Beatrice, about the fear in her eyes when she talked about her husband, about the courage it must have taken for her to run, about the baby growing inside her, innocent and unaware of the danger it had already been through. He found himself worrying about her, wondering if she was all right, if she had everything she needed, if she was scared being alone in a strange place. The next morning, Henry was up before dawn, working through his chores with unusual haste. He told himself he was just keeping his word, checking on someone who needed help. But when he caught himself shaving and putting on his best shirt before heading to town, he had to admit there was more to it than that. He stopped at the general store first, buying a few things he thought Beatrice might need. Soap that smelled like lavender, a warm shawl, some ribbon for her hair. The store clerk, a gossipy woman named Mrs. Henderson, raised her eyebrows at his purchases, but wisely kept her questions to herself. At the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson informed him that Beatrice was up and having breakfast in the dining room. Henry found her sitting by the window, a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, sunlight turning her hair to gold. She looked better already, some color in her cheeks, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of a restless night. "Good morning," Henry said, hat in hand. "Mind if I join you?" Beatrice's face lit up. "Please do. I was hoping you would come." They talked over coffee, easy conversation about small things. Henry told her about his ranch, about his plans to expand his herd in the spring. Beatrice asked questions, seeming genuinely interested, and Henry found himself enjoying her company more than he had enjoyed anyone's in a long time. She was smart and funny when she allowed herself to be, with a quick wit and a way of seeing the world that made even ordinary things interesting. The days fell into a pattern. Henry would come into town every morning bringing Beatrice small gifts or just his company. They would have breakfast together, then walk through Republic, Henry introducing her to the townsfolk, making sure everyone knew she was under his protection. The people of Republic were good sorts, and they accepted Beatrice without judgment, welcoming her into their community. As the days turned into weeks, Beatrice grew stronger. The fear in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. She smiled more, laughed at Henry's stories, began to plan for her future. She got a job helping at the general store, Mrs. Henderson having taken a liking to her. It was light work, sorting inventory and helping customers, but it gave Beatrice a purpose and a way to earn her keep. And through it all, Henry was there. Not hovering, not demanding, just present. A steady, solid presence she could rely on. He fixed the loose board on the boarding house steps. He brought her books from his own small collection. He taught her to ride properly, taking her on gentle excursions into the countryside on Copper, pointing out landmarks and sharing the history of the territory. It was on one of these rides, nearly a month after he had found her in the snow, that things changed between them. They had ridden up to a meadow Henry particularly loved, a sheltered valley with a creek running through it, surrounded by pine trees. The snow had mostly melted here, leaving the ground damp but not frozen, and early wildflowers were beginning to poke through the earth. They dismounted and walked along the creek, Beatrice exclaiming over the flowers, bending to examine them closely. Henry watched her, his chest tight with an emotion he was not quite ready to name. She had blossomed over the past weeks, coming back to life like the land after winter. Her laughter came easily now, her smiles were genuine, and the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes was gone. "This place is beautiful," Beatrice said, straightening up with a handful of wildflowers clutched in her hand. "How did you find it?" "I stumbled on it a few years back when I was tracking a lost calf. I come here sometimes when I need to think." Henry looked around at the meadow, then back at her. "I wanted to share it with you." Beatrice met his eyes and something passed between them, something electric and undeniable. "Henry," she said softly, "why have you been so good to me? I told you why, your sister, I know, but it feels like more than that now." She took a step closer to him. "These past weeks you have become the best part of my day. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether I will see you, and I need to know if I am alone in feeling this way." Henry's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "You are not alone," he said roughly. "Beatrice, I have been half in love with you since the moment you opened your eyes in that cabin, but I did not want to push, did not want to make you feel like you owed me anything." "Owed you?" Beatrice laughed, but it was a sound of joy, not mockery. "Henry, you saved my life. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. You made me believe I could be happy again. If anything, I owe you everything." "You do not owe me anything," Henry said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I want you to choose me because you want to, not because you feel obligated." "Then I choose you," Beatrice said, her eyes shining. "I choose you, Henry Fallon. I choose this, whatever this is between us." Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "I am going to take care of you," he whispered. "You and the baby. I am going to give you the life you deserve. I swear it." Beatrice pulled back just enough to look up at him. "I love you," she said simply. "I did not think I would ever say those words to anyone again, but I love you." Henry kissed her then, gently at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body fitting perfectly against his. It was a kiss full of promise, of new beginnings, of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, I know you are not even divorced yet, but I do not care about legalities. Marry me, Beatrice. Be my wife in every way that matters." "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They stood there in the meadow, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun began to set and the sky turned colors that had no names. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they both felt completely, utterly at peace. The practical matters took time to sort out. Beatrice needed to be divorced before they could legally marry, and that meant dealing with her past in a way she had been dreading. But with Henry beside her, giving her strength, she wrote to a lawyer in Portland, explaining her situation and requesting a divorce on the grounds of abuse and abandonment. The response came 6 weeks later, and it was not what they had hoped for. Thomas had refused to grant a divorce. More than that, he had hired investigators and learned that Beatrice was in Republic. He was demanding she return to Portland immediately, claiming she had stolen money from him and abandoned her marital duties. Beatrice was terrified when she read the letter, her hands shaking so badly that Henry had to take it from her to read it himself. "He is coming for me," she whispered. "He is going to force me to go back." "Like hell he is," Henry said, his voice dangerously calm. "Beatrice, listen to me. The law might be on his side in Portland, but this is the Washington Territory, not Oregon. Things work differently here, and you have people here who will stand with you. I will stand with you. But he has lawyers, money. And I have a shotgun and a willingness to use it if he tries to take you by force." Henry took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I told you that you were not alone anymore. I meant it. We will fight this together." The next few weeks were tense. Henry consulted with the territorial marshal, a grizzled veteran named Jack Porter, who had no love for men who beat their wives. Porter made it clear that while the law required Beatrice to honor her marriage until properly divorced, he was not about to help Thomas drag her back to Oregon against her will. "Far as I am concerned," Porter told them, "she is a resident of the Washington Territory now, and what happens here is territorial business, not Oregon business. If her husband wants to come fetch her, he is welcome to try, but he better bring more than lawyers and threats." In early April, Thomas arrived in Republic. He came with 2 men he introduced as attorneys, riding into town in a fancy carriage that looked absurd on the muddy frontier streets. He went straight to the marshal's office, demanding that his wife be returned to him immediately. Henry was there within minutes of hearing the news, along with half the men in town who had come to care for Beatrice. They filled the marshal's office and spilled out into the street, a silent, grim-faced wall of support. Thomas was a handsome man, Henry had to admit, with dark hair and expensive clothes and the kind of smooth charm that would appeal to many. But Henry could see the cruelty in his eyes, the contempt in the way he looked at the rough frontier men surrounding him. "I do not know what lies my wife has told you," Thomas said, addressing Marshal Porter but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But she is legally my wife, and she belongs with me in Portland. I demand you release her into my custody immediately." "She is not in custody," Porter said mildly. "She is a free woman living peacefully in Republic, and she has made it clear she does not wish to return with you. What she wishes is irrelevant. She is my property under law." The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Henry took a step forward, his fists clenched, but Marshal Porter held up a hand. "Actually," Porter said, his voice hard now, No woman is any man's property in my jurisdiction, law or no law. Your wife has made serious allegations against you, Mr. Miller. Allegations of physical abuse and cruelty. If you try to remove her from Republic by force, I will arrest you for assault. If you harass her in any way, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace. And if you so much as raise your voice in her direction, I will invite Mr. Fallon here to settle the matter in whatever way he sees fit. Are we clear? Thomas's face flushed with rage. This is outrageous. I have rights. So does she. And right now, her rights matter more to me than yours. Porter leaned back in his chair. My suggestion, Mr. Miller, is that you go back to Portland and give your wife the divorce she has requested. Otherwise, this is going to get very unpleasant for you. Thomas looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, and for a moment, Henry thought he might be foolish enough to try something. But whatever Thomas was, he was not stupid. He could see he was outnumbered and outmatched. This is not over, he said, his voice low and venomous. He pointed at Henry. And you, whoever you are when the law comes for you for harboring another man's wife, do not say you were not warned. I am Henry Fallon, Henry said calmly, and you are welcome to take your best shot, Miller, but I promise you it will be your last mistake. Thomas left Republic that afternoon, his carriage rattling away down the muddy street, but not before he had made one more attempt to see Beatrice. He went to the boarding house, pounding on the door and demanding to see his wife. Mrs. Patterson had called for Henry and the marshal, and by the time they arrived, half the town had gathered, forming a protective circle around the boarding house. Beatrice, watching from her window, saw Thomas for the first time in months. Henry could see her face go white, see her body start to shake. He took the stairs 3 at a time and burst into her room, gathering her into his arms. I am here, he said fiercely. He cannot hurt you. I will not let him. He is going to ruin you, Beatrice said, her voice muffled against his chest. He is going to use his lawyers and his money to destroy you for helping me. Then he can try. Beatrice, look at me. He tipped her face up to his. I do not care what he does. I do not care what it costs me. You are worth fighting for. You and our baby, you are worth everything. Beatrice had told him a week ago that she wanted him to raise the child as his own, to be its father in every way. Henry had been moved beyond words, and he had promised her that he would love the baby as if it carried his own blood. Now, holding her as she trembled in fear of the man who had tormented her, Henry made another silent promise. He would make sure Thomas Miller never got the chance to hurt her again. By evening, Thomas was gone, and the town settled back into its normal rhythm. But everyone knew this was not over. Thomas would not give up easily, and the law, for all Marshal Porter's good intentions, was ultimately on Thomas's side. It was Dr. Wright who came up with the solution. He arrived at Henry's ranch 3 days after Thomas had left, his expression thoughtful. I have been thinking about your situation, he said, accepting the coffee Henry offered. And I believe I have an idea that might help. Henry leaned forward, listening intently as the doctor explained. In the Washington Territory, certain judges had the authority to grant divorces quickly in cases of proven abuse, particularly if the woman was carrying a child and there was concern for its welfare. Dr. Wright happened to know such a judge, a man named Harrison who rode the circuit and was known for his progressive views on women's rights. If Beatrice testifies about the abuse, and if I provide medical documentation of her old injuries, Judge Harrison might be willing to grant her a divorce without requiring Thomas's consent, Dr. Wright said. It is not common, but it has been done. The question is whether Beatrice is willing to stand up in court and tell her story. When Henry brought the idea to Beatrice, she was scared but determined. "If it means being free of him," she said, "I will do whatever it takes." Judge Harrison arrived in Republic 2 weeks later, and the hearing was held in the town hall. It was not a public trial, but word had spread, and the hall was packed with supporters. Henry sat beside Beatrice, holding her hand as she testified, his heart breaking as she recounted in detail the abuse she had suffered. Thomas's lawyers had sent a representative, a cold-eyed man who tried to discredit Beatrice, suggesting she was lying, that her injuries had been accidents, that she was an unfaithful wife trying to escape her marital duties. But Dr. Wright's testimony was damning, as was the testimony of several Portland residents who had been subpoenaed and spoke reluctantly about the screams they had heard coming from the Miller house. The times they had seen Beatrice with black eyes and broken bones. In the end, Judge Harrison ruled in Beatrice's favor. The divorce was granted, with the judge stating firmly that no woman should be forced to remain married to a man who treated her as property and subjected her to violence. Thomas's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, but for now, Beatrice was free. She walked out of that courthouse into the spring sunshine, and Henry was waiting for her. She ran to him, laughing and crying at once, and he lifted her up and spun her around, both of them giddy with relief and joy. "It is over," Beatrice said, her hands framing his face. "I am free. I am really free." "Then marry me," Henry said. "Today, right now. Let us not waste another moment." They were married that afternoon in a simple ceremony at the town church with half of Republic in attendance. Beatrice wore a dress Mrs. Patterson and several other women had spent the week sewing for her, a beautiful creation of pale blue silk that made her eyes look like the summer sky. Henry wore his best suit, and he could not stop smiling as the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When he kissed her, the church erupted in cheers and applause, and Henry felt like his heart might burst from happiness. This woman, this incredible, brave, beautiful woman, was his wife. They were building a life together, a family together, and nothing was going to tear them apart. The months that followed were the happiest of Henry's life. Beatrice moved into the ranch, and together they turned the cabin into a real home. She planted a garden, hung curtains, filled the rooms with warmth and laughter. Henry expanded the barn and bought more cattle, building the ranch into something substantial, something that could support a family. In late August, on a warm night filled with stars, Beatrice went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Henry spent most of it pacing outside the bedroom where Dr. Wright and Mrs. Patterson attended her, terrified every time he heard her cry out. But when he finally heard the thin, angry wail of a newborn, he burst through the door, desperate to see for himself that Beatrice was all right. She was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she was smiling as she held the tiny bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," she said softly. "We have a son, Henry." Henry approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant. He was perfect, impossibly small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and flailing fists. "He is beautiful," Henry whispered. "You are both so beautiful." They named him James Samuel Fallon, after Henry's father and Dr. Wright, who had helped bring him into the world. Henry had never known love like this, a love so fierce and protective it was almost painful. He would wake in the night to check on his son, to make sure he was breathing, to marvel at the tiny miracle sleeping in the cradle Henry had built with his own hands. Beatrice was an amazing mother, patient and loving and strong. She had been terrified during her pregnancy that she would not be able to love the child because of its connection to Thomas, but the moment James was born, all her fears evaporated. He was hers, and he was Henry's, and nothing else mattered. The first year of James's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, first words and first steps. Henry taught his son to ride almost before he could walk, sitting him in front of the saddle on Copper and walking them around the corral. Beatrice taught him songs and stories, filling his days with love and laughter. When James was 2 years old, Beatrice found out she was pregnant again. This time it was easier, the pregnancy uncomplicated, and in the spring of 1886 they welcomed a daughter into their family. She was born with blonde hair like her mother and gray-green eyes that reminded Henry of mountain mist. They named her Eleanor after Henry's mother, and she was as different from James as night from day, quiet where he was loud, thoughtful where he was impulsive. Henry's ranch prospered. He became known throughout the territory for the quality of his horses, and buyers came from as far as Seattle to purchase from him. He hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, good men who became like family. The cabin was expanded into a proper house, with multiple bedrooms and a large kitchen where Beatrice baked bread that was famous in Republic. On James's 5th birthday, Henry was working in the barn when Beatrice came to find him. She had a strange expression on her face, and for a moment Henry felt a jolt of fear. "What is wrong?" he asked, setting down the harness he had been mending. "Nothing is wrong," Beatrice said slowly. "But I received a letter today from Portland, from a lawyer I do not know." Henry's blood ran cold. "Thomas?" "No." Beatrice shook her head, her expression still odd. "Thomas is dead, Henry. He died 6 months ago. Consumption. The lawyer was writing to inform me because I am listed in the will." Henry did not know what to say. He had hated Thomas Miller with an intensity that had surprised him, but he had never wished the man dead. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. "I think so. I do not know what I feel, honestly. Relief, maybe, guilt for feeling relieved." She looked up at him. "But that is not all. The lawyer says Thomas left everything to his children. James is his biological child, so he is entitled to a significant inheritance." Henry sat down heavily on a hay bale. "What does that mean?" "It means our son is going to be a wealthy man someday. There is property in Portland, investments, quite a lot of money. It is all being held in trust for him until he is 21. Beatrice sat beside Henry, taking his hand. "What should we do?" "We tell him the truth when he is old enough to understand," Henry said after a long moment. "We tell him that the man who fathered him is not the same as the man who raised him, and that he can choose what to do with that money when he is grown. But until then, we keep raising him the way we have been, teaching him to work hard and treat people with respect. Money does not change who he is. He is our son." Beatrice leaned her head on Henry's shoulder. "Our son," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." As the years passed, the Fallon family grew and thrived. James grew into a strong, capable boy with his mother's kindness and his father's determination. Eleanor was quieter but no less strong, with a love for books and learning that Henry encouraged by teaching her to read and write before she was 4 years old. In 1888, Beatrice gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Robert and Grace. The house was chaos with 4 children, but it was joyful chaos, filled with noise and laughter and love. Henry would come in from working the ranch to find children everywhere, climbing on furniture, playing with the dog, begging their mother for cookies, and he would think about the day he had found Beatrice in the snow and thank God he had been riding that trail at that moment. When James turned 10, they sat him down and told him the truth about his parentage. Henry had been dreading this conversation for years, terrified that James would feel betrayed or would see Henry differently. But James listened quietly, asked a few thoughtful questions, and then said simply, "You are my father. I do not care about anyone else." Henry had to leave the room for a few minutes to compose himself, overwhelmed with love for this boy who had chosen him so easily, so completely. Republic grew and changed over the years. The railroad came through in 1890, bringing more people and more commerce. The town expanded, new buildings went up, and the population swelled. But the heart of the community remained the same. The good people who looked after each other, who rallied around their own in times of trouble. Henry became a respected figure in Republic, known for his fairness, his hard work, and his devotion to his family. He served on the town council, helped establish a school, and was always ready to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. But his greatest pride always was his family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry took Beatrice back to the meadow where they had first confessed their love for each other. It was summer, and the meadow was thick with wildflowers, a riot of color under the blue sky. They left the children with Mrs. Patterson for the day and rode out together on Copper, who was old now but still game for a gentle ride. They spread a blanket on the grass and unpacked the picnic lunch Beatrice had prepared. As they ate and talked, Henry found himself thinking about how much had changed since that day 10 years ago when he had found her dying in the snow. "What are you thinking about?" Beatrice asked, watching him with a small smile. "About how lucky I am," Henry said honestly. "About how one moment, one choice changed everything. If I had ridden a different trail that day, if I had not seen you in the snow, if I had convinced myself someone else would come along." "But you did not," Beatrice said softly, moving closer to him. "You stopped. You saved me. You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have." "You gave me just as much," Henry said, pulling her into his arms. "More even. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be the best man I can be." "I love you, Beatrice. More than I did 10 years ago, more than I did yesterday, more than I will tomorrow, even though I know that is impossible." Beatrice kissed him, a long, sweet kiss full of promise and memory. "I love you too, always." They lay on the blanket, watching clouds drift across the sky, holding hands like they had that first day. Henry thought about James, who was already showing signs of the man he would become, strong and kind and smart. He thought about Alina, with her quick mind and gentle heart. He thought about Robert and Grace, still toddlers but already full of personality. He thought about the ranch, thriving and successful beyond his wildest dreams. He thought about the life he and Beatrice had built together, a life forged from tragedy and hardship but shaped by love and determination. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Henry pulled Beatrice to her feet. "Dance with me," he said. "There is no music." "Sure there is. Listen." They stood still, and in the silence of the meadow, Henry heard what he was talking about. The wind rustling through the grass, the creek bubbling over stones, the call of birds settling in for the evening, the steady beat of his own heart synchronized with Beatrice's. "I hear it," she whispered, smiling up at him. They danced in the meadow as the stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and had built something beautiful from the ashes of their pasts. And as Henry held his wife in his arms, swaying to music only they could hear, he knew that this was what happiness looked like. This was what it meant to be home. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. In 1892, when James was 14, they told him about the inheritance waiting for him in Portland. He listened with interest, but said he had no interest in leaving the ranch. "This is my home," he told his parents firmly. "Why would I want to live in some city?" Henry respected his son's decision, but made sure James understood what opportunities the money could provide. Education, travel, the chance to be whatever he wanted to be. James considered this and decided he wanted to study veterinary medicine when he was old enough, to learn to care for animals properly. Henry was immensely proud. Eleanor, at 12, announced that she wanted to be a teacher. She was already helping the younger children in Republic with their lessons, showing a natural gift for instruction. Beatrice encouraged her daughter's ambitions, knowing how important education was, especially for women who wanted independence. Robert and Grace were 7 years old and inseparable, always getting into some kind of mischief together. They kept the household lively, and Henry often joked that they had more energy than all the horses on the ranch combined. In the fall of 1893, tragedy struck when Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire town mourned her loss, and Henry was one of the pallbearers at her funeral. Afterward, as they gathered at the church, Henry held Beatrice close, both of them remembering how Mrs. Patterson had taken Beatrice in without question all those years ago, had given her sanctuary when she needed it most. "She was a good woman," Beatrice said, tears streaming down her face. "She helped save my life just as much as you did." "She believed in giving people second chances," Henry said. "She believed in judging people by who they were, not where they came from. We need more people like that in this world." As winter approached, Henry noticed Beatrice seemed tired more often, moving a bit slower than usual. He urged her to see Dr. Wright, worried something was wrong. But the doctor surprised them both with his diagnosis. "You are pregnant again, Beatrice," he said, smiling. "Congratulations." Henry and Beatrice looked at each other in shock. They had not been expecting this, had not even considered the possibility. Beatrice was 40 now, and they had thought their family was complete. "Are you all right with this?" Henry asked her that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I know this was not planned. I am surprised," Beatrice admitted, "but all right. Yes." "Henry, every child we have had has been a blessing. Why would this one be any different?" The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, her age making everything more difficult. Henry worried constantly, hovering over her, driving her crazy with his overprotectiveness. But Beatrice was strong, and in late spring of 1894 she gave birth to another son. They named him Thomas Henry, and Henry raised an eyebrow at his wife when she suggested the name. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "I am sure," Beatrice said firmly, looking down at the baby in her arms. Thomas was James's biological father, and regardless of what kind of man he was, he gave me my son. And this child is part of that legacy too, in a way. But his middle name is yours, Henry, because you are the father of all my children, the man who made this family possible. I want to remember both truths." Henry understood, and he loved her even more for the grace and wisdom she showed in that choice. The children adored their new baby brother. James, now 16 and nearly a man, was protective and gentle with the baby. Eleanor, 14, took over many of the household chores to give her mother time to rest. Robert and Grace, 9 years old, fought over who got to hold the baby more. The house was full to bursting with love and life. When Thomas Henry was 2 years old, James left for veterinary school in Seattle. It was hard for Henry and Beatrice to watch their eldest son go, but they were so proud of the young man he had become. He promised to write every week, and he kept that promise faithfully. Eleanor followed 2 years later, heading to Spokane to attend the new women's college there and study to become a teacher. Suddenly, the house seemed quieter, though Robert and Grace and young Thomas kept things lively enough. The ranch continued to prosper under Henry's management. He bought more land, hired more hands, and became one of the most successful ranchers in the Washington Territory. But he never forgot where he had come from, and he was known for his generosity, always willing to help a neighbor in need. always ready to give a second chance to someone down on their luck. On the 20th anniversary of the day he had found Beatrice in the snow, Henry surprised her with a trip. He arranged for the younger children to stay with friends in town, and he took Beatrice to Seattle for a week, something they had never done before. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and acted like young lovers again, walking hand in hand through the city streets, laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company without the demands of the ranch and the children. On their last night in Seattle, as they sat on the balcony of their hotel room watching the sun set over Puget Sound, Beatrice turned to Henry with a serious expression. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking me in, marrying me, tying yourself to all my troubles?" Henry looked at her in genuine surprise. "Not for a single second. Beatrice, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. These 20 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. I just think sometimes about what your life could have been if you had kept riding that day. You could have married someone else, someone without my history, someone who did not bring danger to your door. I do not want someone else. I have never wanted anyone but you." Henry took her hands in his. "Beatrice, do you know what my life was before you? It was work and sleep and more work. It was lonely. It was empty. You filled it with light and laughter and love. You gave me children, a family, a reason to build something that will last beyond my lifetime. You made me better than I was. How could I ever regret that?" Beatrice was crying now, but they were happy tears. "I love you so much," she whispered. "I do not think I will ever stop being grateful for that storm, for that moment when you saw me in the snow and decided to stop." "I am grateful too," Henry said. "Every single day." They returned to Republic refreshed and closer than ever. The years continued their steady march forward. James graduated from veterinary school and returned to Republic to set up his practice, quickly becoming the most sought-after animal doctor in the territory. He fell in love with a rancher's daughter named Sarah, and they married in a beautiful ceremony in the same church where Henry and Beatrice had wed. Alina completed her teaching degree and took a position at the Republic School, becoming beloved by her students for her patience and creativity. She eventually married a newspaperman named David who had moved to town to start the local paper, and they gave Henry and Beatrice their first grandchildren, twin girls who looked just like their mother. Robert decided he wanted to join the military, much to Beatrice's worry, but Henry supported his son's choice. Robert served with distinction and returned home 3 years later, ready to help run the ranch alongside his father. Grace, always the most adventurous of the children, announced she wanted to study medicine. It was almost unheard of for women to become doctors, but Henry and Beatrice encouraged her dreams, helping her gain admission to a medical school back east. Young Thomas, growing up surrounded by older siblings who doted on him, was a happy, curious child who loved the ranch and everything about it. He followed Henry everywhere, asking endless questions about the horses and the cattle and the land. Henry saw so much of himself in his youngest son, the same love of the outdoors, the same quiet strength. In 1906, Henry and Beatrice celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. The entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. James and Sarah came with their 3 children. Alina and David brought their twins and a new baby boy. Robert, now married to a schoolteacher named Catherine, had just announced they were expecting their first child. Even Grace made the long journey home from medical school back east, arriving with stories of her studies and her plans for the future. As Henry looked around at the crowd gathered in his home, at the children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had become like family, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was his legacy. Not the successful ranch, not the land or the money. This family, these relationships, this love that had spread out from one moment of compassion on a snowy mountain trail. During the party, Beatrice pulled him aside, leading him out to the porch where they could have a moment of relative quiet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and she leaned against him, sighing contentedly. 25 years, she said softly. A quarter of a century. Best 25 years of my life, Henry said, kissing the top of her head. Do you remember what you said to me when I first woke up in that cabin, after you had saved me? Henry thought back, trying to recall the exact words. I told you that you were safe. You told me I was not alone anymore, Beatrice corrected gently. And you know what? You were right. From that moment forward, I have never been alone. You have been with me through everything, standing by my side, giving me strength when I had none of my own. You kept your promise, Henry. Every single day for 25 years, you have kept your promise. And I will keep on keeping it, Henry said firmly. For as long as I draw breath, Beatrice, you will never be alone. They stood together on the porch, watching the sunset, listening to the sounds of their family celebrating inside. And Henry thought about that young cowboy who had almost missed seeing a dark shape in the snow, who had almost kept riding. He thought about how different his life would be if he had made a different choice that day. But he had stopped. He had helped. And in doing so, he had found everything he had never known he was looking for. The years grew kinder to them as they aged. Henry's hair turned silver and his joints ached in the mornings, but he still worked the ranch every day, refusing to fully retire. Beatrice's hair went white as snow, and she moved a bit slower than she once had. But her mind was sharp as ever, and she still kept their home running smoothly. They became grandparents many times over, welcoming each new baby with joy and wonder. They watched their children build successful lives, passing on the values Henry and Beatrice had taught them. Hard work, honesty, compassion, the importance of helping those in need. Young Thomas took over more of the ranch responsibilities as Henry aged, showing the same skill and dedication his father had. He married a woman named Anna, who reminded Henry very much of Beatrice, strong and kind and full of grace. They gave Henry and Beatrice 3 more grandchildren to spoil. Grace completed medical school and opened a practice in Seattle, becoming one of the few female doctors in the Pacific Northwest. She never married, too devoted to her work, but she found fulfillment in healing others, in making a difference. Henry was enormously proud of her courage and determination. In the spring of 1915, Henry turned 65 years old. Beatrice threw him a birthday party that seemed to include half of Republic. As he stood in his yard, surrounded by family and friends, watching his grandchildren play, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. He had lived a good life. He had loved deeply and been loved in return. He had built something that would last beyond his own lifetime. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Henry and Beatrice lay in bed, their hands intertwined between them like they had done for 30 years. You ever think about that day? Beatrice asked softly. The day you found me, sometimes, Henry admitted. Usually when I am counting my blessings. I think about it often. I think about how close I came to dying in that snow, and then I think about everything that came after, everything we built together, and I am just amazed. This life we have, Henry, it is more than I ever dreamed was possible. It is exactly what you deserved, Henry said. Happiness, safety, love. You always deserved those things, Beatrice. I am just grateful I got to be the one to give them to you. We gave them to each other, Beatrice corrected. You saved my life that day, but I like to think I saved yours too in a different way. We saved each other. Henry pulled her close, kissing her softly. We did, he agreed, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done countless times before, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a love that had withstood every challenge, every storm. The years continued to pass, each one a gift. Henry and Beatrice grew old together, their love deepening with time rather than fading. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. They celebrated births and marriages, mourned losses, and held each other through everything. On a warm summer evening in 1920, when Henry was 70 years old and Beatrice 67, they took a final ride together to the meadow where they had first confessed their love. It was harder now, their bodies protesting the journey, but they were determined. This place meant too much to them to let it go. They sat on a blanket, just as they had done so many times before, and watched the sun set. The meadow was full of wildflowers, just as it had been that first time, a rainbow of colors swaying in the gentle breeze. "I am not afraid," Beatrice said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Afraid of what? Of dying? Of our story ending?" She looked at him, her blue eyes still clear and bright despite her age. "Because I know that what we built together, it will go on. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, they are all part of this love story that started with you pulling me out of the snow. They carry it forward every day. So, in a way, it will never really end." Henry felt tears prick his eyes. "You are the wisest woman I have ever known, Beatrice Fallon. I had a good teacher." She smiled at him, that same smile that had captivated him 37 years ago. "Thank you, Henry, for everything, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you," Henry echoed. "For choosing me, for trusting me, for making every day an adventure worth waking up for." They sat together as the stars began to appear, talking quietly about their life, their family, their dreams for the future they would not see but knew would be bright because of the foundation they had laid. And when they finally rode back to the ranch as the moon rose high above, they did so hand in hand, their love as strong as it had ever been. Henry lived to be 75 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep in the home he had built, surrounded by the family he adored. Beatrice held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering her love for him one final time. She followed him just 18 months later, her heart simply deciding it was time to be with him again. They were buried side by side in the Republic Cemetery, under a large oak tree with a view of the mountains. Their grave marker read, "Henry Fallon and Beatrice Miller Fallon. Together they found home." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations. The house Henry had built was maintained lovingly, a testament to the love story that had started there. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their great-grandfather had found their great-grandmother in the snow, how he had told her she was not alone anymore, and how that promise had shaped the entire family's destiny. And on winter days, when the snow fell thick and white over the Washington mountains, the Fallon descendants would look out at the landscape and remember. They would remember that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that one moment of compassion could change everything, and that the greatest legacies were not built from wealth or fame, but from the simple act of reaching out to help another human being in need. The story of Henry and Beatrice became a legend in Republic, passed down through the years, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, even in the darkest moments, love could bloom and flourish and create something beautiful that would last for generations. Their love story had started with snow and survival, with fear and uncertainty, but it had grown into something magnificent. Something that proved that when two people commit to walking through life together, to facing whatever comes with courage and grace and unwavering devotion, There is nothing they cannot overcome. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Henry had given Beatrice that day on the mountain trail. Not just her life, though that was precious. Not just safety, though that mattered deeply. He had given her the promise that she would never face the world alone again. And he had kept that promise every single day for the rest of his life, building a love so strong, so true, so pure that it echoed through the decades, touching everyone who came after them. Their great-great-grandchildren, gathering for family reunions at the old ranch, would walk through the house and feel the love that had built it. They would ride through the meadow where Henry and Beatrice had danced and know they were standing on sacred ground. They would hear the story of the blizzard, the rescue, the words that had started everything, and they would understand that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a love story that had defied every odd and created a legacy of compassion, devotion, and hope. And when winter storms rolled through Republic, covering the mountains in white, the oldest members of the Fallon family would stand at their windows and imagine a young cowboy on a mountain trail, spotting a dark shape in the snow, making the choice to stop and help. They would whisper a thank you to that long-ago man for his compassion, for his courage, for the love he had built with the woman he saved. Because Henry Fallon had been right that day in the cabin when Beatrice first opened her eyes. She was not alone anymore. She never had been, from that moment forward. And through their children and grandchildren and all who came after, she would never be alone. Their love had created a family, a legacy, a story that would be told for generations. A reminder that the greatest adventures begin not with a destination, but with a choice to care, to love, and to never let go.